The morning mist clung to the Ardennes forest like a shroud on December 15th, 1944, as Private First Class Samuel Washington knelt in the frozen earth beside his foxhole, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air that hung at 20 degrees below zero. The 28th Infantry Division had been holding this sector for 3 days, and the German forces positioned just 800 meters across the valley had maintained an almost supernatural accuracy with their sniper fire, picking off any American soldier who dared expose himself for more than a few seconds. Washington's fellow soldiers huddled in their positions, whispering prayers and checking their ammunition, believing this would be just another day of the grinding stalemate that had characterized the Western Front for weeks. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, faith, and the mysterious ways that hope can manifest in the darkest moments of human conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would transform not only the men of the 28th Infantry Division, but also the German marksmen, who found themselves unable to explain why their most carefully aimed shots seemed to curve around one particular American soldier who refused to abandon his morning ritual of prayer, no matter how intense the enemy fire became. Samuel Washington had never intended to become a symbol of anything more than quiet determination. Born in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1922, he was the son of a Baptist preacher who had instilled in him a faith that ran deeper than the red clay soil of his hometown. When the war came, Samuel enlisted not out of any grand sense of patriotism, but because his younger brother had been drafted, and he believed someone should look out for the boy. The irony was bitter and complete. His brother had been assigned to the Pacific Theater and was serving safely in a supply depot in Hawaii, while Samuel found himself in the frozen hell of the European conflict. The morning ritual had begun 3 weeks earlier, when the division first arrived in this sector. Every day at exactly 6:30 in the morning, as the first pale light began to filter through the bare branches of the oak and pine trees, Samuel would leave the relative safety of his foxhole, walk 10 paces forward toward the German lines, kneel in the open ground, and spend exactly 5 minutes in silent prayer. His squad leader, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a tough Irish-American from Boston who had survived the landing at Normandy, had initially ordered him to stop this dangerous practice. "Washington, you're going to get yourself eliminated and probably take some of us with you when they start laying down covering fire," O'Brien had said on the first morning, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen too many good soldiers make fatal mistakes. "Those German marksmen across the valley aren't playing games. They've got some of the finest precision rifles in the world, and they know how to use them." But Samuel had looked at his sergeant with eyes that held a quiet certainty that O'Brien found difficult to argue with. "Sergeant, my daddy always told me that a man's got to have something bigger than himself to believe in, especially when everything around him is falling apart," Samuel had replied, his voice carrying the soft cadence of his Alabama upbringing. "I've been talking to the Lord every morning since I was 7 years old, and I don't plan to stop now just because some folks across the valley might not appreciate it." The theological debate might have continued, but the practical reality of military hierarchy intervened when Captain Robert Harrison, the company commander, arrived to inspect the forward positions. Harrison was a West Point graduate from Pennsylvania, who had earned his commission the hard way through 2 years of grueling combat from the beaches of Sicily through the liberation of France. When O'Brien explained the situation, Harrison studied Samuel for a long moment, then made a decision that would echo through the ranks for decades to come. "Son, if your faith gives you strength, then it gives strength to your unit," Harrison said finally. "But I want you to understand that if you're going to do this, you're not just risking your own life. Every man in this company is going to be watching you, and what happens to you out there is going to affect their morale, their faith in their own abilities, and their trust in whatever higher power they might believe in. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Samuel had nodded without hesitation. "Sir, I believe that when a man lives according to his convictions, it makes everyone around him a little bit stronger, regardless of what those convictions might be. I'm not asking anyone else to do what I do, but I'm not going to stop doing what I believe is right." The first morning, every soldier in the company who could manage it had found some excuse to watch as Samuel walked out into the open ground. The German positions were clearly visible across the valley, a series of well-constructed defensive works that had been carved into the hillside with typical German engineering precision. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had at least 12 sniper teams in that sector, equipped with the finest optical equipment and rifles that could consistently hit targets at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. As Samuel knelt in the frozen earth, his dark silhouette clearly visible against the pale snow, the American soldiers held their breath and waited for the inevitable crack of rifle fire. The German marksmen had demonstrated their deadly accuracy repeatedly over the past weeks. Lieutenant James Mitchell from Georgia had been picked off while adjusting his binoculars. Corporal Tony Ricci from New Jersey had been eliminated while passing a message between foxholes. Private First Class David Kim, a Japanese-American soldier from California, serving in the segregated unit, had been taken down while attempting to retrieve supplies from a fallen comrade. But as Samuel knelt there in silent prayer, his lips moving slightly as he communicated with whatever higher power he believed was listening, no shots rang out across the valley. The morning silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of artillery fire from other sectors and the occasional crack of shifting ice in the nearby stream. After exactly 5 minutes, Samuel rose, nodded once toward the German positions as if acknowledging their restraint, and walked calmly back to his foxhole. The American soldiers looked at each other with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to relief to something approaching awe. Sergeant O'Brien was the first to speak, his Boston accent thick with emotion. "Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle," he said quietly. "Either that boy's got the luck of the Irish or somebody upstairs is paying attention." But it was Private First Class Marcus Thompson, another African-American soldier from Detroit, who voiced what many of them were thinking. "Maybe those German boys over there figured one prayer couldn't hurt anybody," he said with a slight smile. "Maybe they figured even enemies can respect a man's right to talk to his God." The speculation might have ended there, dismissed as a single moment of battlefield courtesy or enemy confusion, but Samuel repeated his morning ritual the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 3 weeks. Each morning, the German marksmen maintained their silence during those 5 precious minutes, creating a pocket of peace in the middle of a conflict that had already claimed more than 400,000 American lives. What the American soldiers did not know, and would not learn until after the conflict ended, was that the German sniper teams were engaged in increasingly heated discussions about the strange American soldier who knelt each morning in their crosshairs. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a 23-year-old marksman from Bavaria who had been trained at the Wehrmacht's elite sniper school, had been the first to spot Samuel through his telescopic sight. Müller was known among his unit for his exceptional accuracy and his methodical approach to his deadly profession. He had accounted for 47 confirmed eliminations since arriving on the Western Front, and his Carabiner 98 rifle with its Zeiss optical scope had never failed him. On that first morning, as Samuel knelt in prayer, Müller had lined up what should have been a routine shot. The distance was approximately 750 meters, well within his effective range. The target was stationary and clearly silhouetted against the light background. Wind conditions were minimal. Every factor favored a successful engagement. But as Müller applied pressure to the trigger, something unprecedented happened. His finger froze, not from the cold, which he was accustomed to after months of winter fighting, but from something deeper. Later, he would struggle to explain it to his squad leader, Feldwebel Klaus Weber, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had little patience for philosophical complications. "What do you mean you could not take the shot?" Weber had demanded, his voice carrying the harsh authority of a man who had survived 3 years of the most brutal fighting in human history. "The target was clear, the conditions were perfect, and you had orders to eliminate any American soldier who exposed himself in that sector." Müller had stared at his rifle for a long moment before answering. "Feldwebel, I have been a marksman for 2 years. I have never hesitated before, but when I saw that American soldier kneeling there, not hiding, not threatening anyone, just praying, I could not bring myself to pull the trigger. It felt like I would be committing some kind of sacrilege. Weber had studied his subordinate with the calculating gaze of a professional soldier. Müller was not given to flights of fancy or religious sentiment. He was a practical, efficient killer who had never shown any qualms about his duties. This unexpected hesitation was both puzzling and potentially dangerous. Müller, we are not paid to make moral judgments about our targets, Weber said finally. We are here to win this conflict, and that means eliminating enemy soldiers when the opportunity presents itself. Personal feelings have no place in this profession. But Müller's hesitation was not an isolated incident. Over the following days, other German marksmen reported similar experiences. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, a former hunting guide from the Black Forest region, who had enlisted after his village was occupied by American forces, found himself unable to fire when Samuel appeared in his scope. Obergefreiter Josef Krantz, a cold and methodical sniper from Prussia, who had accounted for more than 60 confirmed eliminations, discovered that his hands would shake uncontrollably whenever he tried to target the preying American. The situation became even more mysterious when the German soldiers began to notice that their usual accuracy seemed to suffer whenever they attempted to engage other American targets during Samuel's morning prayer sessions. Shots that should have found their marks sailed harmlessly wide. Carefully calculated trajectories seemed to curve at the last moment. Even veteran marksmen with years of experience found themselves missing targets at ranges that should have been elementary. Feldwebel Weber, a man who had built his reputation on rational analysis and practical solutions, found himself confronting a problem that defied both logic and military doctrine. His sniper teams, previously the most effective unit in the sector, were beginning to doubt their own abilities. Morale was suffering, and worse yet, some of the men were beginning to whisper about supernatural intervention and divine protection. The situation came to a head on December 20th, when Weber decided to personally take responsibility for eliminating the preying American soldier. Weber had been a marksman before he became a squad leader, and his skills had not diminished with his promotion to leadership. He positioned himself with a perfect view of Samuel's morning prayer site, equipped with the finest rifle and optical equipment available to the German forces. As Samuel walked out into the open ground that morning, Weber settled into his familiar firing position and began his routine calculations. Distance, 720 meters. Wind, minimal, from the southwest at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. Temperature, minus 15 degrees Celsius, which would slightly affect bullet trajectory. All factors were well within acceptable parameters for an accurate shot. But as Weber watched Samuel kneel and begin his silent prayer, something extraordinary happened. Through his telescopic sight, Weber found himself studying not just a target, but a human being engaged in an act of profound faith. Samuel's face, clearly visible through the powerful scope, showed no fear, no awareness of the danger he was in, only a deep and abiding peace that seemed to radiate from his very being. Weber had eliminated dozens of enemy soldiers over the course of the conflict. He had learned to see them not as individuals with families and dreams and fears, but as obstacles to be removed in service of his country's objectives. This psychological distance was essential to maintaining effectiveness as a marksman, but as he watched Samuel pray, that distance collapsed completely. For the first time in 3 years of combat, Weber found himself thinking about the humanity of his target. He wondered what Samuel was praying for. Was he asking for protection, for strength, for his family back home? Was he praying for his enemies as well as his friends? Weber had been raised in a Lutheran household, and despite the hardening effects of military service, he still retained some memory of what it meant to approach the divine with humility and hope. As Weber struggled with these unfamiliar thoughts, his finger remained motionless on the trigger. The perfect shot opportunity stretched on, second after second, until finally Samuel rose, nodded toward the German positions, and walked back to safety. Weber lowered his rifle with hands that were trembling not from cold, but from an emotion he could not name. That evening, Weber called his sniper teams together for what he intended to be a stern discussion about military discipline and professional responsibility. But as he looked into the faces of his men, he saw his own confusion and uncertainty reflected back at him. These were not weak soldiers or religious fanatics. They were hardened veterans who had survived years of the most brutal fighting in human history. Yet all of them had been affected by the sight of one American soldier kneeling in prayer. "I want to understand what is happening here," Weber said finally, abandoning his prepared speech about duty and obedience. "Muller, tell me again about your experience this morning." Muller shifted uncomfortably before answering. "Feldwebel, I had the American in my sights for the full 5 minutes of his prayer. The shot was clear, the conditions were perfect. But every time I began to apply pressure to the trigger, I found myself thinking about my younger brother back home. He used to pray every night before bed, the same way our grandmother taught us when we were children. Watching that American soldier pray reminded me of my brother, and I could not take the shot." Hoffman nodded in agreement. "For me, it was my father," he said quietly. "He was a devout man who believed that prayer was the most important thing a person could do, regardless of the circumstances. Seeing that American soldier maintain his faith in the middle of this conflict, it made me think that maybe there are some things more important than military objectives." Krantz, normally the most ruthless and practical of the group, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I have been thinking about this situation, and I believe we are witnessing something that transcends the normal rules of warfare," he said slowly. "That American soldier is not just praying for himself. He is praying in full view of his enemies, demonstrating a faith so strong that he is willing to risk his life for it. Perhaps we are meant to respect that faith, regardless of which side of the conflict we happen to be on." Weber listened to his men with growing amazement. These were soldiers who had been trained to kill without hesitation, who had been indoctrinated with the belief that enemy soldiers were less than human, that showing mercy was a sign of weakness that could cost German lives. Yet here they were, engaged in theological discussions about the nature of faith and the proper response to an enemy's demonstration of religious devotion. The situation became even more complex when reports began to filter in from other German units in the sector. Word of the praying American soldier had spread throughout the German forces, and many soldiers were requesting transfers to Weber's position just to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but many came because they had heard that the presence of the praying soldier seemed to create a pocket of relative peace in an otherwise hellish environment. Hauptmann Friedrich Richter, the company commander responsible for the sector, arrived on December 22nd to investigate the reports that his sniper teams were refusing to engage a clearly visible American target. Richter was a career officer who had distinguished himself in campaigns from Poland through France, a man who valued efficiency and results above all other considerations. He had little patience for what he viewed as sentimental nonsense interfering with military operations. "Feldwebel Weber, I have received disturbing reports about the performance of your sniper teams," Richter began, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "It is my understanding that you have had multiple opportunities to eliminate an American soldier who regularly exposes himself in your sector, yet no action has been taken. Please explain this failure to execute orders." Weber had prepared for this moment, but he still struggled to find words that would convey the complexity of the situation without sounding like he had lost his mind. "Hauptmann, my men have performed their duties with distinction for months. They are experienced, skilled marksmen who have accounted for more than 200 confirmed eliminations since arriving in this sector. However, this particular situation presents certain complications that are difficult to explain in conventional military terms." Richter's expression grew colder. "I am not interested in complications, Feldwebel. I am interested in results. You will point out this American soldier, and you will demonstrate how a professional sniper eliminates a target." The next morning, as Samuel walked out for his daily prayer, Richter positioned himself with Weber's rifle and scope, determined to show his subordinates how to properly execute their duties. Through the telescopic sight, he could see the American soldier clearly as he knelt in the frozen earth, his dark face peaceful and composed despite the mortal danger he was in. Richter had eliminated enemy soldiers at much greater distances under far more difficult conditions. This should have been a routine engagement over in seconds, but as he watched Samuel pray, something unexpected happened. The American soldier's faith was so evident, so genuine, that it seemed to create a kind of sacred space around him. Richter found himself remembering his own childhood prayers, the way his mother had taught him to approach God with reverence and humility. The shot opportunity stretched on, and Richter's finger remained frozen on the trigger. He could not explain, even to himself, why he was unable to fire. The military objectives were clear. The orders were unambiguous, yet something deeper than training or duty was preventing him from taking the shot. When Samuel rose and walked back to his position, Richter lowered the rifle with hands that were shaking with confusion and anger. He had never before hesitated to engage an enemy target, never allowed personal feelings to interfere with his military responsibilities. Yet here he was, apparently as affected by the praying American as his subordinates had been. "This is impossible," Richter muttered, staring at the rifle as if it had betrayed him. "There is no rational explanation for what just occurred." Weber, emboldened by his commander's obvious confusion, decided to voice the theory that had been growing in his mind over the past weeks. "Hauptmann, perhaps we are not dealing with a purely military situation here. Perhaps we are witnessing something that transcends the normal rules of combat. That American soldier is demonstrating a faith so pure, so genuine, that it deserves respect regardless of the conflict between our nations." Richter turned to stare at his subordinate with an expression that mingled disbelief with dawning comprehension. "Are you suggesting, Feldwebel, that we should allow enemy soldiers to move freely in our sector, as long as they are engaged in religious activities?" "No, sir," Weber replied carefully. "I am suggesting that this particular situation is unlike anything we have encountered before. That American soldier is not threatening anyone. He is not gathering intelligence. He is not engaged in any military activity. He is simply maintaining his faith in the face of overwhelming danger. Perhaps there are some things that should remain sacred, even in the middle of a conflict." The theological implications of Weber's statement were staggering, and Richter found himself grappling with questions that had never been addressed in his military training. Was it possible that some human activities transcended the boundaries of warfare? Could an enemy soldier's demonstration of faith create a moral obligation that superseded military orders? These were not the kind of practical, tactical considerations that Richter was accustomed to dealing with. Over the next few days, word of the praying American soldier spread throughout the German forces in the sector, creating an unprecedented situation. Soldiers began to time their activities around Samuel's morning prayer sessions, creating an informal ceasefire that lasted exactly 5 minutes each day. Some German soldiers began to watch Samuel's prayers from concealed positions, not as potential marksmen, but as witnesses to an act of faith that reminded them of their own spiritual backgrounds. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of Oberst Heinrich Zimmermann, a regimental commander who had heard disturbing reports about declining German morale in the sector. Zimmermann was a product of the old Prussian military tradition, a man who believed that sentiment and religious considerations had no place in professional warfare. He arrived on December 25th, Christmas Day, determined to restore proper military discipline to what he viewed as an increasingly chaotic situation. "Hauptmann Richter, I have received reports that suggest serious problems with unit cohesion and operational effectiveness in your sector," Zimmermann began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in some of the most difficult campaigns of the conflict. "It is my understanding that your forces have failed to engage obvious enemy targets, and that morale has suffered as a result of some kind of religious superstition. This situation will be corrected immediately." Richter, who had spent the past 3 days grappling with the implications of Samuel's morning prayers, tried to explain the complexity of the situation. "Oberst, I believe we are dealing with something that goes beyond normal military considerations. The American soldier in question is not engaged in combat activities. He is simply maintaining his religious faith, and my men have found it difficult to reconcile their duties as soldiers with their own spiritual backgrounds." Zimmermann's expression grew thunderous. "Religion has no place on the battlefield, Hauptmann. We are here to win this conflict. not to engage in theological debates with the enemy. You will personally eliminate this American soldier, or I will find someone who will. But as Zimmermann prepared to demonstrate proper military procedure, something unprecedented occurred. Samuel's morning prayer session on Christmas Day attracted the attention of American soldiers from neighboring units who had heard about the mysterious soldier who prayed in full view of the enemy. Nearly 24 American soldiers positioned themselves where they could observe Samuel's ritual, creating an audience that included both friends and enemies. As Samuel knelt in prayer that Christmas morning, with American soldiers watching from their positions and German soldiers observing from across the valley, something remarkable happened. The sight of one man maintaining his faith in the face of mortal danger, surrounded by others who had been touched by his example, created a moment of profound unity that transcended the artificial boundaries of warfare. Zimmermann, watching through his binoculars, found himself confronting a situation that defied every aspect of his military training. Here was an enemy soldier engaged in a purely religious activity, surrounded by comrades who clearly drew strength from his example, observed by German soldiers who had been moved by his demonstration of faith. To eliminate Samuel now would not be a military action, but rather the destruction of something sacred that had emerged from the chaos of conflict. For the first time in his 30-year military career, Zimmermann found himself unable to give the order to fire. The implications were staggering. If faith could create such a profound effect on both sides of a conflict, what did that say about the nature of warfare itself? What did it say about the humanity that persisted even in the darkest moments of human history? As Samuel completed his prayer and rose to return to his position, Zimmermann made a decision that would echo through the remainder of the conflict. Instead of ordering his men to fire, he simply watched as the American soldier walked back to safety, followed by the dispersal of both American and German observers who had witnessed something that none of them would ever forget. The story of Samuel Washington's morning prayers might have remained a localized phenomenon, known only to the soldiers who witnessed it directly, but the arrival of Captain William Morrison, a war correspondent attached to the 28th Infantry Division, ensured that the tale would reach a much wider audience. Morrison was the experienced journalist who had covered conflicts from the Spanish Civil War through the current European campaign. He had seen enough combat to recognize genuine courage when he encountered it, and he had developed an eye for the kind of human interest stories that could convey the deeper meaning of warfare to audiences back home. When he heard about Samuel's morning ritual from Captain Harrison, Morrison immediately recognized the potential significance of the story. "Captain, I've covered a lot of combat situations and I've seen plenty of brave soldiers," Morrison said, as he prepared to observe Samuel's prayer session firsthand. "But I've never heard of anything quite like this. If what you're telling me is accurate, this soldier has managed to create some kind of informal truce through nothing more than his personal demonstration of faith." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what's happened, and I'll be honest with you, Captain Morrison, it's challenged some of my own assumptions about warfare and human nature. These German marksmen across the valley are some of the finest in their army. They could eliminate Samuel any morning they chose to, but for 3 weeks now, they've held their fire during his prayer sessions. More than that, they seem to have developed some kind of respect for what he's doing." Morrison spent the next week interviewing soldiers from both the American and German sides who had been affected by Samuel's prayers. What he discovered was a story that went far beyond simple military courage or religious devotion. He found soldiers who had rediscovered their own faith through witnessing Samuel's example. He found enemies who had been forced to confront the humanity of their opponents. Most remarkably, he found a small pocket of peace that had somehow emerged from the middle of one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The article that Morrison eventually wrote would be published in newspapers across America, but the immediate impact was felt among the soldiers who were living the story day by day. Samuel's prayers had become a focal point for discussions about faith, duty, courage, and the nature of humanity that continued long after the morning rituals ended. Private First Class Marcus Thompson, who had initially joked about German respect for prayer, found himself deeply affected by Samuel's example. Thompson had grown up in Detroit, where he had experienced enough racism and prejudice to develop a cynical view of human nature. But watching Samuel maintain his faith in the face of mortal danger had forced Thompson to reconsider his own beliefs about courage and conviction. "I used to think that faith was something for people who couldn't handle reality," Thompson confided to Samuel one evening as they shared their meager rations. "But watching you pray every morning, knowing that those German marksmen could eliminate you at any second, has made me realize that maybe faith is actually for people who understand reality better than the rest of us." Samuel smiled with the quiet confidence that had characterized his approach to the entire situation. "Marcus, my daddy always told me that faith isn't about avoiding difficulty or pretending that bad things don't happen. Real faith is about maintaining your connection to something bigger than yourself, especially when everything around you seems designed to make you forget that bigger purpose exists." The conversation was overheard by Sergeant O'Brien, who had initially opposed Samuel's morning prayers, but had gradually become one of their strongest supporters. O'Brien had been raised Catholic in Boston, but years of military service had worn away much of his religious devotion. Watching Samuel pray each morning had rekindled something in O'Brien that he thought he had lost forever. "You know, Washington, when I first saw you walk out there to pray, I thought you were either the bravest man I'd ever met or the craziest," O'Brien said with a slight smile. "Now I'm thinking maybe those two things aren't as different as I used to believe." The impact of Samuel's prayers was not limited to the American soldiers who witnessed them directly. Reports from German prisoners of war indicated that word of the praying American had spread throughout their forces, creating discussions about faith, duty, and the nature of warfare that challenged many of the assumptions that had sustained German military morale. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission in late December, spoke freely about the effect that Samuel's prayers had on the German forces. "We heard about the American soldier who prayed every morning, and at first we thought it was some kind of propaganda or psychological warfare," Hoffmann told his interrogators. "But when we saw it for ourselves, when we watched that man kneel in prayer knowing that any of us could have eliminated him, it made us think about what we were fighting for and what kind of men we wanted to be." The theological implications of Hoffmann's statement were not lost on Chaplain Robert Davies, a Methodist minister from Ohio who served as the division's religious coordinator. Davies had struggled throughout the conflict to help soldiers reconcile their faith with the violence they were required to perform. Samuel's morning prayers provided a powerful example of how religious conviction could persist even in the darkest circumstances. "What Private Washington has accomplished goes far beyond personal devotion," Davies wrote in his weekly report to divisional headquarters. "He has demonstrated that faith can transcend the artificial boundaries that warfare creates between human beings. The respect that enemy soldiers have shown for his prayers suggests that some aspects of human nature remain constant, regardless of political or military circumstances." But perhaps the most significant impact of Samuel's prayers was felt by the German soldiers who had been tasked with eliminating him. Feldwebel Weber, who had initially viewed the situation as a simple failure of military discipline, found himself engaging in the kind of theological reflection that he had not experienced since his childhood. "I have been thinking about what it means to be a soldier," Weber confided to Hauptmann Richter during one of their evening briefings. "We are trained to eliminate enemies, to remove obstacles to our nation's objectives. But when I see that American soldier pray, I am reminded that our enemies are human beings with their own hopes and fears and faith. Perhaps the highest form of soldiering is not the ability to eliminate enemies, but the wisdom to recognize when something transcends the boundaries of warfare." Richter, who had experienced his own moment of hesitation when confronted with Samuel's faith, found himself nodding in agreement. "Weber, I have been a soldier for 20 years, and I have always believed that military objectives must take precedence over personal feelings. But this situation has forced me to confront questions that I never expected to face. If we eliminate that American soldier, we are not just removing an enemy combatant. We are destroying something that has brought meaning and hope to soldiers on both sides of this conflict." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a message from regimental headquarters, but the questions that had been raised continued to resonate through the German forces. For the first time in the conflict, Significant numbers of German soldiers were openly questioning whether some human activities deserve protection, even in the middle of warfare. The situation reached its climax on January 1st, 1945, when both American and German forces received orders for a major offensive that would eliminate the informal truce that had developed around Samuel's prayer sessions. The American 28th Infantry Division was ordered to advance across the valley and capture the German defensive positions, while the German forces were ordered to repel the attack with all available resources. Captain Harrison received the operational orders with a heavy heart. He understood the military necessity of the offensive, but he also understood that it would inevitably end the remarkable period of peace that had developed around Samuel's prayers. "Washington, I want you to know that tomorrow morning will probably be your last opportunity to pray in that location," Harrison told Samuel privately. "Once the offensive begins, that ground will become a battlefield, and I won't be able to guarantee your safety." Samuel received the news with the same calm acceptance that had characterized his approach to the entire situation. "Captain, I understand the necessities of warfare, and I would never ask you to compromise military objectives for my personal practices, but I want you to know that these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life, not because of what I was doing, but because of what it seemed to represent for everyone who witnessed it." That evening, word spread through both American and German forces that the informal truce would end with the morning offensive. Soldiers on both sides found themselves grappling with emotions that they struggled to understand. Many had come to see Samuel's prayers as a symbol of something larger than the conflict itself, a reminder that human dignity and faith could persist even in the most difficult circumstances. Private Thompson approached Samuel as they prepared for what everyone understood would be the final prayer session. "Samuel, I want you to know that watching you pray every morning has changed something in me," Thompson said quietly. "I don't know if I'll survive tomorrow's offensive, but if I do, I'm going to remember what you taught me about maintaining faith when everything around you seems designed to destroy it." Sergeant O'Brien echoed Thompson's sentiments. "Washington, when this conflict is over, people are going to ask me what I learned from all the fighting and suffering. I'm going to tell them about a soldier who taught me that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is kneel down and pray, even when his enemies are watching." Similar conversations were taking place on the German side of the valley. Feldwebel Weber gathered his sniper teams for what he knew would be their final discussion about the praying American soldier. "Men, tomorrow we will return to our normal duties as soldiers," Weber said slowly. "But I want you to remember what we have witnessed over the past weeks. We have seen an enemy soldier demonstrate a faith so genuine that it transcended the hatred and fear that warfare creates. Perhaps that is something we should carry with us, regardless of what tomorrow brings." Obergefreiter Müller, who had been the first German marksman to encounter Samuel, found himself struggling with emotions that he had not experienced since childhood. "Feldwebel, I know that tomorrow I may be ordered to engage that American soldier, and I will follow my orders as a professional soldier should. But I want you to know that these past weeks have reminded me that there are aspects of humanity that remain constant, regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in." The morning of January 1st dawned clear and cold, with a bitter wind that cut through the thickest winter clothing and created ice crystals in the air that glittered like diamonds in the pale sunlight. Samuel Washington rose early, as he had every morning for the past 3 weeks, and prepared for what he knew would be his final prayer session in the open ground between the opposing forces. As he walked toward his usual prayer site, Samuel was surprised to discover that soldiers from both sides had positioned themselves where they could observe his final ritual. American soldiers from multiple companies had found excuses to be in positions that offered clear views of the prayer site, while German soldiers had openly gathered at observation points across the valley. What had begun as a private religious practice had evolved into something approaching a formal ceremony. Samuel knelt in the frozen earth for the last time, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air as he began his silent conversation with the divine. But this morning was different from all the previous ones. Instead of praying only for his own strength and guidance, Samuel found himself praying for all the soldiers who had been touched by his example, both American and German. He prayed for their safety in the coming battle, for their families back home, and for the possibility that some measure of the peace that had emerged from his prayers might survive the violence that was to come. As Samuel prayed, something unprecedented occurred. On both sides of the valley, soldiers began to remove their helmets in a gesture of respect that transcended military protocol and national boundaries. American soldiers stood at informal attention, honoring one of their own who had demonstrated courage of a kind that few of them had ever witnessed. German soldiers observed their own moment of silence, acknowledging an enemy who had reminded them of the faith and humanity that persisted, despite the artificial hatreds of warfare. When Samuel completed his prayer and rose to return to his position, he was greeted by something that would remain etched in the memories of everyone who witnessed it. Soldiers on both sides of the valley began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a crescendo that echoed across the frozen landscape. It was not applause for military achievement or tactical success, but recognition of something far more profound, the demonstration that human faith and dignity could survive even the most extreme circumstances. As Samuel walked back toward his position, he paused halfway and turned to face the German positions across the valley. Then, in a gesture that surprised even himself, he raised his hand in a simple wave of acknowledgement and gratitude. The response was immediate and overwhelming. German soldiers emerged from their concealed positions to wave back, creating a moment of human connection that temporarily dissolved the boundaries that warfare had created between enemies. The informal ceasefire that followed Samuel's final prayer lasted nearly an hour, as soldiers on both sides seemed reluctant to begin the violence that would end the remarkable period of peace that had developed around his mourning rituals. But eventually, military necessity reasserted itself, and the opposing forces began their preparations for the offensive that would capture or destroy the German positions. The battle that followed was fierce but brief. The German forces, perhaps influenced by their weeks of observing Samuel's prayers, offered less resistance than expected. When the American advance reached the German defensive positions, they found that many of the enemy soldiers had withdrawn during the night, leaving behind only a small rear guard to conduct a fighting retreat. Among the captured equipment, American soldiers discovered something that would become one of the most treasured artifacts of the entire conflict: a handwritten note left by Feldwebel Weber, addressed to the American soldier who prays. The note, written in careful English, read, "To the brave American who maintained his faith before our eyes, you have shown us that some things remain sacred even in the midst of war. We could not fire upon a man at prayer, and we have been better soldiers and better men for having witnessed your courage. May God protect you in the trials to come, and may your example continue to inspire all who hear your story." The note was signed not only by Weber, but by every member of his sniper team and by dozens of other German soldiers who had been affected by Samuel's example. Captain Morrison, the war correspondent who had been documenting Samuel's story, recognized the historical significance of the document immediately. "Private Washington, what you accomplished here goes beyond anything I've seen in years of covering this conflict," Morrison said as he examined the German note. "You managed to create a bridge of human understanding between enemies, and you did it through nothing more than your personal demonstration of faith. This story is going to give hope to people all over the world." But Samuel, with the quiet humility that had characterized his approach throughout the entire experience, was more interested in the practical implications of what had occurred. "Captain Morrison, I hope that people understand that what happened here wasn't about me personally," Samuel said thoughtfully. "It was about the power of faith to remind us of our common humanity, even when everything around us seems designed to make us forget that we are all children of the same God." The story of Samuel Washington's prayers spread rapidly through the American forces and eventually reached audiences around the world. But perhaps more importantly, it continued to influence the soldiers who had witnessed it directly. Many of the men who had observed Samuel's morning rituals found that their own faith had been strengthened by his example, and they carried that renewed spiritual conviction with them through the remainder of the conflict. Private Thompson, who had initially been cynical about religion, became one of Samuel's most dedicated supporters and eventually pursued theological studies after the war ended. Sergeant O'Brien, whose Catholic faith had been dormant for years, returned to regular religious practice, and credited Samuel with helping him rediscover the spiritual foundation that had sustained his immigrant family through decades of hardship. Even more remarkably, the story continued to resonate among the German soldiers who had been unable to fire upon Samuel during his prayer sessions. After the conflict ended, several of these men made contact with American military authorities, specifically to share their memories of the praying American soldier and to express their gratitude for the example he had provided. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the former hunting guide who had been captured in late December, spent the remainder of the conflict as a prisoner of war in a camp in Pennsylvania. There, he became known for his detailed accounts of Samuel's morning prayers and their effect on the German forces. Hoffmann's stories, translated by German-American civilians working at the prisoner of war camp, provided valuable insight into the psychological impact that Samuel's faith had on enemy soldiers. The American soldier who prayed taught us something that no military training could provide. Hoffmann told his fellow prisoners during one of their evening discussions. He showed us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to maintain your deepest convictions, even when you know that doing so might cost you your life. Whether we win or lose this conflict, that lesson will stay with me forever. The theological implications of Samuel's story were not lost on military chaplains on both sides of the conflict. Chaplain Davies, who had initially viewed Samuel's morning prayers as a potential security risk, became one of the most eloquent advocates for the spiritual significance of what had occurred. What Private Washington accomplished represents one of the most powerful demonstrations of applied Christianity that I have witnessed in 20 years of ministry. Davies wrote in a detailed report that was eventually distributed to religious leaders throughout the Allied forces. He showed us that faith is not something to be practiced only in the safety of peaceful circumstances, but rather a foundation that becomes most important precisely when we find ourselves in the greatest danger. The report included detailed accounts of the positive effect that Samuel's prayers had on unit morale and cohesion, as well as testimonies from soldiers who credited Samuel's example with helping them maintain their own spiritual beliefs during the darkest periods of the conflict. Davies concluded by recommending that Samuel's story be included in the training materials provided to military chaplains, as an example of how individual faith could strengthen entire military units. But the most significant long-term impact of Samuel's morning prayers may have been their effect on post-conflict efforts to build understanding between former enemies. The story of the German marksman, who refused to fire upon a praying American soldier, became a powerful symbol of the humanity that could persist even during the most brutal conflicts. In the years following the end of hostilities, several of the German soldiers who had observed Samuel's prayers made contact with American veteran organizations to share their memories and to express their continuing respect for the man whose faith had touched their lives. These contacts led to ongoing correspondence between former enemies and eventually to personal meetings that helped heal some of the wounds that the conflict had created. Feldwebel Weber, who had written the note to the American soldier who prays, survived the conflict and eventually became a Protestant minister in post-war Germany. In his sermons and writings, Weber frequently referenced Samuel's morning prayers as an example of how faith could transcend the artificial barriers that human conflict creates between people of different nations and backgrounds. I learned more about Christianity from watching that American soldier pray than I had learned from years of formal religious instruction, Weber wrote in his memoir, which was published in Germany in 1952 and later translated into English. He showed me that true faith is not about doctrine or theology, but about the willingness to live according to your deepest convictions, regardless of the consequences. Weber's memoir included detailed descriptions of the effect that Samuel's prayers had on German morale and unit cohesion, providing historical documentation of one of the most unusual episodes in the entire conflict. The book became required reading in several German theological seminaries, where it was used to illustrate the power of personal witness in even the most difficult circumstances. Samuel Washington himself returned home to Alabama after the conflict ended, where he resumed his quiet life as a farmer and lay preacher in his local Baptist church. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, preferring to let others tell the story of his morning prayers. When pressed by journalists or historians for his own perspective on what had occurred, Samuel consistently emphasized that he had simply done what his faith required, regardless of the circumstances in which he found himself. "I never set out to make a statement or to influence anyone else," Samuel told a reporter from the Montgomery Advertiser in 1948. "I just knew that I needed to maintain my connection to God, and that meant praying every morning the way my daddy taught me when I was a boy. If that helped other people somehow, then I'm grateful. But it was never about anything more than trying to live according to my beliefs." Samuel's humility about his wartime experiences was characteristic of his approach to life in general. He continued to farm the same land that his family had worked for generations, attending the same church where his father had served as a deacon, living quietly and simply according to the principles that had sustained him through the conflict. But despite his preference for privacy, Samuel's story continued to spread, inspiring countless individuals who were struggling to maintain their own faith in difficult circumstances. The story reached international audiences when Captain Morrison's articles were republished in European newspapers, creating discussion about the role of religion and personal conviction in warfare. The tale of the German marksman, who refused to fire upon a praying American soldier, became a symbol of hope for those who believed that human dignity could survive even the most extreme circumstances. In 1955, Samuel was invited to speak at a conference on military chaplaincy at the Pentagon, where his story was presented as an example of how individual faith could strengthen entire military units. Samuel was reluctant to accept the invitation, but was eventually persuaded by his pastor and by representatives from veteran organizations who believed that his testimony could provide valuable guidance for future military chaplains. Samuel's speech at the Pentagon was brief and characteristically humble, but it included insights that resonated with military and religious leaders from around the world. "Faith is not something you practice when it's convenient," Samuel told the assembled audience. "Real faith is what you hold on to when everything around you seems designed to make you let go. If my morning prayers helped anyone else remember that, then maybe all the danger and difficulty was worthwhile." The speech was recorded and transcribed, and excerpts were eventually included in the training materials used by military chaplains from multiple Allied nations. Samuel's story became a standard example of how personal religious conviction could provide strength and inspiration, not only to individual soldiers, but to entire military units facing extreme circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of Samuel's wartime service came not from official military or religious organizations, but from the soldiers who had witnessed his morning prayers directly. In 1958, veterans from the 28th Infantry Division organized a reunion that was specifically dedicated to honoring Samuel's memory and sharing stories about the impact that his faith had on their own lives. More than 200 veterans attended the reunion, including Marcus Thompson, who had become a successful businessman in Detroit, while maintaining the renewed faith that Samuel's example had inspired. Thompson had organized the event specifically to give veterans an opportunity to express their gratitude for what Samuel had accomplished during those difficult weeks in the Ardennes. "Samuel Washington taught us something that no military training could provide," Thompson told the assembled veterans. "He showed us that courage is not just about facing physical danger, but about maintaining your deepest convictions when everything around you seems designed to destroy them. Every one of us who served with Samuel came home a better man because of his example." Sergeant O'Brien, who had traveled from Boston for the reunion, echoed Thompson's sentiments. "When people ask me what I learned from the conflict, I tell them about a soldier who taught me that prayer is not a sign of weakness, but the foundation of real strength," O'Brien said. "Samuel never preached to us or tried to convert us to his way of thinking. He just lived according to his beliefs, and that was more powerful than any sermon I ever heard." The reunion included presentations from several European veterans who had made the journey to America specifically to meet Samuel and to share their own memories of his morning prayers. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the former German hunting guide who had been unable to fire upon Samuel, spoke movingly about the long-term impact that the experience had on his own spiritual development. "That American soldier's prayers saved more than his own life," Hoffmann told the assembled veterans, speaking through a translator. "They saved something in all of us who witnessed them, something that reminded us that we were human beings first and soldiers second. I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life. The reunion concluded with a ceremony in which Samuel was presented with letters of appreciation from veterans around the world, many of whom credited his example with helping them maintain their own faith during the darkest periods of the conflict. Samuel accepted the recognition with characteristic grace and humility, but his response emphasized the collective nature of what had been accomplished. What happened in those woods in Belgium wasn't about one man's faith, Samuel said in his closing remarks. It was about what happens when people remember that they are connected to something bigger than the conflicts that seem to divide them. All of you who were there, American and German alike, you were part of something that proved human dignity can survive even the worst circumstances. I was just blessed to be one small part of that demonstration. Samuel Washington continued to live quietly in Alabama until his death in 1983, maintaining the same humble faith that had sustained him through his wartime experiences. His funeral was attended not only by family and neighbors from his local community, but by veterans from around the world who had traveled to Alabama to pay their respects to the man whose morning prayers had touched their lives decades earlier. Among the mourners were several former German soldiers, including Feldwebel Weber, who had become a close friend through decades of correspondence. Weber delivered one of the eulogies, speaking about the lasting impact that Samuel's faith had on his own spiritual development and on his understanding of the possibilities for reconciliation between former enemies. Samuel Washington taught me that the highest form of courage is not the willingness to take life, but the willingness to live according to your deepest convictions, regardless of the consequences, Weber said, his voice thick with emotion. He showed us that faith is not something to be practiced only in times of safety and comfort, but rather the foundation that becomes most important when we face our greatest challenges. The service concluded with the reading of letters from veterans around the world who had been unable to attend but wanted their gratitude recorded for posterity. The letters, which were eventually compiled into a memorial volume, provided detailed testimonies about the long-term impact that Samuel's morning prayers had on the lives of countless individuals who had witnessed them either directly or through the stories that spread throughout the military forces. One of the most moving letters came from Marcus Thompson, who had been unable to travel to Alabama due to illness, but had written extensively about what Samuel's example had meant to him over the decades since the conflict ended. Samuel Washington changed my life by showing me that faith is not about having all the answers, but about maintaining hope and dignity when you can't see any reason for optimism, Thompson wrote. Every morning when I wake up, I remember that soldier kneeling in prayer while enemy marksmen watched, and I try to face my own challenges with even a fraction of his courage and conviction. The memorial volume, which was published by a consortium of veteran organizations in 1984, became one of the most widely read accounts of individual courage during the entire conflict. The book included not only testimonies from American veterans, but also detailed accounts from German soldiers who had been affected by Samuel's prayers, providing a unique perspective on how individual acts of faith can transcend the artificial boundaries that warfare creates between human beings. The story of Samuel Washington's morning prayers continued to inspire new generations long after the conflict ended. Military academies around the world began to include Samuel's story in their ethics and leadership curricula, using his example to illustrate how personal conviction can provide strength and inspiration in the most difficult circumstances. At the United States Military Academy at West Point, Samuel's story became a centerpiece of discussions about the relationship between personal faith and military duty. Cadets were encouraged to consider how Samuel's unwavering commitment to his morning prayers had strengthened not only his own resolve, but the morale and cohesion of his entire unit. Private Washington demonstrated that true leadership is not always about giving orders or making tactical decisions, one West Point instructor explained to his ethics class. Sometimes the most powerful form of leadership is simply living according to your deepest convictions, regardless of the personal cost. Samuel's morning prayers inspired soldiers on both sides of the conflict because they demonstrated a level of courage and authenticity that transcended military rank or national boundaries. Similar discussions took place at military academies throughout Europe, where Samuel's story was presented as an example of how individual acts of faith and courage could create possibilities for understanding and reconciliation even between enemies. The story was particularly influential in post-war Germany, where it became a powerful symbol of the potential for moral regeneration and spiritual renewal following periods of national trauma. The theological seminaries that incorporated Samuel's story into their curricula focused on different aspects of his experience, but most emphasized the power of personal witness in extreme circumstances. Samuel's willingness to maintain his morning prayers despite the obvious danger became a standard example of how genuine faith requires the courage to live according to one's convictions, regardless of external pressures. Samuel Washington understood something that many Christians struggle to grasp, explained Dr. Martin Fisher, a theology professor at the University of Heidelberg who had written extensively about Samuel's story. He understood that faith is not a private matter to be practiced only in the safety of church buildings or personal homes. Real faith requires the willingness to witness to your beliefs in public, even when doing so might cost you everything you hold dear. Fisher's analysis, which was published in theological journals throughout Europe and America, explored the broader implications of Samuel's story for understanding the relationship between faith and public witness. Fisher argued that Samuel's morning prayers represented one of the purest examples of Christian witness in the 20th century, precisely because they were performed without any expectation of personal gain or recognition. Samuel Washington did not pray in the open ground between enemy forces in order to make a statement or to influence others, Fisher wrote. He prayed because his faith required it, regardless of the circumstances in which he found himself. That authenticity, that complete absence of self-consciousness or calculation, was what made his witness so powerful and so transformative for everyone who observed it. The story continued to spread through religious communities around the world, inspiring countless individuals who were struggling to maintain their own faith in difficult circumstances. Churches of all denominations began to use Samuel's story as an example of how personal conviction could provide strength and guidance during periods of trial and uncertainty. In the rural Baptist church in Alabama, where Samuel had worshipped for most of his life, a memorial window was installed that depicted a soldier kneeling in prayer while beams of sunlight broke through storm clouds overhead. The window became a popular destination for pilgrims and visitors who wanted to pay their respects to Samuel's memory and to reflect on the power of faith to transcend human conflict. The church also established an annual memorial service that brought together veterans, religious leaders, and community members to celebrate Samuel's legacy and to discuss the continuing relevance of his example. The services featured speakers from around the world who had been touched by Samuel's story, creating an ongoing dialogue about the role of faith and personal conviction in addressing contemporary challenges. One of the most moving annual speakers was Klaus Müller, the son of Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had been the first German marksman to encounter Samuel in his telescopic sight. Klaus had grown up hearing his father's stories about the American soldier who prayed under enemy fire, and those stories had shaped his own understanding of courage, faith, and the possibilities for reconciliation between former enemies. My father never forgot the American soldier who knelt in prayer while German marksmen watched, Klaus told the congregation during one memorial service. That image stayed with him for the rest of his life, reminding him that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, there are individuals who maintain their connection to something higher and better than the hatred and fear that warfare creates. Samuel Washington's prayers changed my father's understanding of what it means to be a soldier and what it means to be a human being. The annual memorial services continued for decades, drawing participants from around the world who wanted to honor Samuel's memory and to explore the continuing relevance of his example. The discussions that emerged from these gatherings often focused on how Samuel's story could provide guidance for addressing contemporary conflicts and challenges. Religious leaders, veterans, historians, and peace activists found common ground in celebrating Samuel's demonstration that individual acts of faith and courage could create possibilities for understanding and reconciliation that transcended political and cultural boundaries. The story became a touchstone for interfaith dialogue and a powerful example of how personal witness could influence others without requiring shared doctrinal beliefs. As the decades passed and the conflict receded into historical memory, Samuel Washington's story took on even greater significance as new generations struggled to understand the lessons that could be drawn from one of the most devastating periods in human history. Educational institutions around the world began to include Samuel's story in curricula designed to teach students about the power of individual conscience and the importance of maintaining moral convictions under pressure. High schools and universities used Samuel's example to explore questions about the relationship between personal faith and public responsibility, the nature of courage in extreme circumstances, and the possibilities for human understanding across cultural and political divides. Students were encouraged to consider how Samuel's unwavering commitment to his morning prayers had created a moment of profound unity between enemies, and what that might suggest about the potential for similar breakthroughs in contemporary conflicts. The story proved particularly powerful for students who were themselves struggling with questions of faith, identity, and purpose in an increasingly complex and challenging world. Many found inspiration in Samuel's example of quiet determination and authentic conviction, recognizing that his courage lay not in dramatic gestures or heroic actions, but in his simple refusal to abandon his deepest beliefs, regardless of external pressures. One student essay, written by a young woman at Columbia University in 1995, captured the continuing relevance of Samuel's example for new generations. Samuel Washington shows us that the most powerful form of resistance to hatred and violence is not counter-violence, but the simple act of maintaining your humanity and your connection to something larger than the conflict around you. His morning prayers were not a political statement or a military strategy, but they accomplished something that no amount of firepower could achieve. They reminded everyone who witnessed them that human dignity and faith can survive even the most extreme circumstances. The essay was published in the university's literary magazine and was eventually reprinted in publications around the world, demonstrating the continuing power of Samuel's story to inspire and guide new generations facing their own challenges and uncertainties. As the 21st century began, Samuel Washington's story continued to resonate with audiences around the world who were grappling with questions about faith, courage, and the possibilities for human understanding in an increasingly divided world. The story had transcended its original historical context to become a timeless example of how individual conviction could create moments of profound unity and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The digital age brought new opportunities to share Samuel's story with global audiences through websites, online forums, and social media platforms that allowed people from different cultures and backgrounds to discuss the continuing relevance of his example. Veterans organizations, religious groups, and educational institutions created online resources that preserved the testimonies of those who had witnessed Samuel's prayers directly, ensuring that their memories would be available to future generations. One particularly successful online project was the Samuel Washington Digital Archive, created by a consortium of military historians, religious scholars, and technology specialists. The archive included video interviews with surviving veterans, digitized versions of historical documents related to Samuel's story, and interactive timelines that allowed users to explore the broader context of his wartime service. The archive also featured discussion forums where visitors could share their own reflections on Samuel's example and explore how his story might provide guidance for contemporary challenges. These discussions often revealed the universal appeal of Samuel's story, as participants from different countries, religions, and backgrounds found common ground in celebrating his demonstration of faith and courage under extreme pressure. One forum participant, a teacher from Japan, wrote, "Samuel Washington's story reminds us that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to remain true to your deepest convictions, regardless of external pressures." His morning prayers created a moment of peace and understanding between enemies, showing us that even the most entrenched conflicts can be transformed by individual acts of courage and faith. Another participant, a veteran of more recent conflicts, added, I have served in combat zones around the world, and I have seen how hatred and fear can consume entire populations. But Samuel Washington's story gives me hope that there are always individuals who refuse to be defined by the conflicts around them, who maintain their humanity and their faith regardless of circumstances. We need more people like Samuel Washington in our world today. These online discussions demonstrated the continuing power of Samuel's story to inspire and unite people across cultural and political boundaries, proving that his example of faith and courage remained as relevant in the digital age as it had been during the dark days of the European conflict. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.